Good morning, Julie.
Hi, Tom.
I want to thank everybody for tuning in to our latest episode of How They Do It, Tech in the Cities, and to thank our generous sponsors, Uber, Spectrum, Civic Hall, TikTok, Google, DoorDash, and Snapchat. Julie, tell us about the interesting episode you taped.
This was such a great conversation. I talked to Mitch Weiss, who's a professor of management practice at Harvard Business School. He teaches the school course on public entrepreneurship, is actually, I would say, the country's leading expert on thinking about entrepreneurship in government. And he's so interesting and he's so thoughtful. He wrote a great book called We the Possibility a couple of years ago. I totally would recommend people read that. And he's got this really great new newsletter that we talked about called Chief of Stuff, which he's been posting on LinkedIn. And in it, he spends a lot of time talking about AI and government, which is obviously something I think a lot about, Tom. I think you're thinking a lot about, and I have a guess that a lot of our listeners are probably thinking about as well.
But it sounds like a really interesting conversation also about AI and teaching and learning and how it affects teachers and students. I'm curious to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I love so much about Mitch and how he thinks about this is he's firmly grounded in the real world, if you will. Like, Mitch understands that technology is here to stay, doesn't want to put his head in the ground. What is that, an ostrich? What animal puts their head in the sand?
Ostrich. Yep.
He doesn't want to put his head in the ground like an ostrich, but he also, doesn't think that necessarily the technology is going to solve every single problem.
Right.
And so he comes at this from a really thoughtful perspective. And I've known Mitch for a long time, and I have known that he's been thinking about this for a long time. He was one of the first people in academia I knew who was just playing with the AI tools.
Right.
And because of that, I think he's got a really good sense of what's working and what's not. And I think that's what all of our academic institutions are going to have to grapple with going forward.
Something I never heard was him talking about how AI can help teachers do simulations before they teach, which I think is fascinating to make teachers or professors better teachers, which I love that.
I think that, Mitch's feeling was that's one of the best use cases so far. And listen, I think Harvard Business School lectures, they're not low stakes,
Right.
So
exactly.
I think it's in that context great, but I think in a lot of contexts it would be great. Imagine you could try things out and get a slightly better sense of what will resonate with your class.
Yeah, listen, maybe Kamala Harris and probably not Donald Trump are doing AI simulations as we speak.
Yeah, right. But as we record this, the debate is coming up.
Something tells me that Donald Trump is not using an AI simulation of the debate tomorrow night.
Actually, do you think, and I guess by the time that folks are listening to this will know, do you think they'll talk about AI at the debate?
Doubtful. I don't think Trump can spell it.
You don't think Trump can spell AI? I think that though it would be a missed opportunity if they didn't. And I think that plays into why this conversation with Mitch was also interesting, because it taught the modern kind of the current rollout of these technologies, how we're thinking about AI and how it implicates classrooms and governments and our economy and how we communicate. I mean, everything, how we get news. That stuff is really going to impact.
It's arguably one of the most important things that government is going to tackle the next 4 years. And I don't see it coming up on any surveys of like, what's the most important topics? You see the economy, inflation, democracy, but you don't see AI pop up.
Yeah, that's why this conversation was really great. Maybe the way that we should all be thinking about it more broadly is kind of sector specific. Instead of talking about AI like this big, scary or exciting thing, we should be talking about what it means for education and what it means for any given industry. So maybe that's a good way to tee up this conversation with Mitch, because we do dive into what it means for education. And I think putting those specifics around the conversation help us understand it a lot better.
That's a great lens. I like that. I'm looking forward to hearing it.
So without further ado, here is the conversation. Mitch, thanks so much for joining us. Why don't you just start us off by quickly introducing yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
I'm Mitch Weiss. I'm the Richard Menschel Professor of Management Practice at Harvard Business School. I teach entrepreneurship. I teach actually public entrepreneurship. So most of my time is spent on thinking about invention inside governments and for it. I'm also the faculty chair of their first year program here at Harvard Business School. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how we have courses and classes for all 930 of our first year MBA students. And as such, spend a lot of time helping think about where the school is headed more broadly.
Part of why I was really excited to talk to you today is that you're one of the first
people I know in academia who is really starting to think about AI tools as it relates not to teaching computer science or data science, but to what it means for teaching. So I'm curious. Well, I would love you just to start by talking a little bit about how you were early on that, and then kind of how you came to be interested in that. And then we can dig in a little bit more on where you think we are and where you think we're going.
Yeah, I don't know if I was early in the sense that if you were really, really early, you would have been spending a lot of time on this, 2 decades ago. But certainly since the advent of chatbots really thrust this into people's perspective, I've been thinking a lot about it for teaching and learning. I think that interest came, Julie, from two places. One was, yes, I study invention inside government, and so I'm always interested in the latest technologies in government, and so this was going to have an impact there, and so I began delving into AI in that part of my work. But also, given all my roles here as a teacher and as someone who helps coordinate other teachers, I was deeply interested in what it would mean here at Harvard Business School. But the moment when I really, I think, started going deep, it was actually, I can remember it specifically. It was March of last year, I guess, so March of 2023. And it was like spring break week here. And it struck me that it was the same week when we had to essentially make this massive shift at the school in the wake of COVID in the year 2020 to remote learning. And there were huge mindset shift and huge technology shift, and lots of resources moved in the direction of enabling online learning, which was good. But it struck me that this technology, AI, would have a much more massive impact on teaching and learning than Zoom. And I didn't witness, at least yet, at our school or many others, nearly as big a shift of mindset and resources. And so I decided just to start trying. And so I spent that week, it was spring break, the students were here. I spent that week just going deep all day, every day on what I could get AI to do to help me become a better teacher. And also to try to think about, how our students might engage with it to become better learners. So it was that, Julie. It was that experience of going, gosh, there's something really seismic happening here. And we need to be ready for it and be engaged in it. And I'm just going to try to see how proficient I can make myself.
Let's get super specific. What are some of the things that you think are exciting? Like, what are some of those tools that can make you a better teacher?
I love, for example, using it to make a teaching simulation with a prompt that's actually not very long. You can say, I'm going to class to teach about this. Create me X number of student persona, 3 or 30. I'm going to start asking questions. I'd like you to have the students answer the questions as those persona. I'd like you to wait until I ask follow-up questions and then try to answer those follow-up questions. And I can, with a handful of just those lines as a prompt, essentially mimic my Harvard Business School classroom. And it's not obviously a substitute for teaching and learning. No, no, no. It's a way to get ready to go into class. So teaching simulation is really one of my favorite ones. One of the great arts of teaching is asking great questions. And so a little mini prompt that I love to do is just say, here's the question I'm planning to ask in class. How do I make it harder?
How do you make it harder?
How do you make it harder? Or sharper? I mean, you owe the students that to ask them really good questions. There are ways to help to use it to try to build out syllabi, your core syllabus. I teach a course on public entrepreneurship. I'm interested in adding a session on AI. I'd like to make it applied. I can upload my syllabus as it stands and ask for some ideas about, where a session might fit and on what it might be good. And you don't just take what ChatGPT or any other tool, Gemini, Claude, tell you to do, but you can start to get into a brainstorm and really interlocute with your AI about how to make your classes harder, better, more advanced, more applied, all of that. So simulation, preparation, course development, some stuff for students. So there's a reflection exercise I do with students, which I give them this prompt to paste into their chatbots, which is, I just finished this course on public entrepreneurship. I want you to ask me these questions. I'm going to answer them. And then I want you to ask me follow-up questions to deepen my reflection. And one of the questions is, what's one thing from this course you want to remember for the rest of your life? And so the AI then asks the student that, the student answers, and then the AI will say, we don't quite know what it will say, but it'll say, well, like, why'd you pick that? Or why do you want to remember that? Or what do you hope remembering that will do? And it's an amazing way to actually formulate a deeper reflection. I've also built a handful of other exercises for the course. I built this great exercise we call Storode that's been a great exercise for learning about how to use AI for ideation and problem solving. So, I mean, there are tons of specific uses.
Do you find the students are receptive?
The students are very receptive, and we have very curious and engaged and lovely students. In every room I've been in over the last year teaching about teaching with AI or about AI, whether it's executives, whether it's MBA students, whether it's other teachers teaching them about AI, I always find a very similar distribution in the room, which is there are a handful of people who are like superpower users. And there are a handful of people, even still. I was doing this yesterday with a group, and there were two people in the room who have never touched a chatbot. And then there's a group in the middle that sort of often used it for recipes or for running routes or like a vacation itinerary, but maybe dabbled, but haven't really dived deep. And I would say I'm among our students, obviously there are probably more that tilt and more now that tilt towards being, more advanced users, but a lot of them were still hesitant or tentative or just mini triers. And so one of the roles I think we have as teachers is to actually alight them to the possibilities here. And there was this moment, Julie, when we were doing one of my exercises, and afterwards a student said, "Oh my God, I just realized my whole career has changed." And so the students are receptive, but I think there's a role for teachers in helping them see the potential here. And by the way, also the potential risks. I mean, we haven't touched on it, but so I think they're receptive, but there's also a role for teachers to invite, I think, more engagement and reception too.
Definitely want to talk about the potential risks, but first I want to dig in just a little bit more on the teachers, because I know you're doing teacher training for other teachers, not just at Harvard, but worldwide. I've seen just anecdotally a lot of teachers who are interested, who are excited, kind of like you are, but also tons who are really resistant, not just because of the risks, just because they're resistant. It strikes me that that's going to change the student experience so much, and that so much about education is well, especially at the graduate level, especially at HBS, it's hyper specific, but it's also really about preparing students just to be people in the world with the tools that exist in the world. And because AI is not, because we're still early, and because it's not solidified kind of how it fits in curriculum, some depending on your teachers could really make a difference. Anyway, so I'm just curious to hear a little bit from you on your takeaway from these trainings that you're doing, and any kind of tips or advice to get teachers more interested, excited about these tools.
I think the thing you just said is really the foundation, which is the students are going into this world. And so like when we were making policy here at Harvard Business School really last year about, how the students should or shouldn't engage with the tools, we made, I think, a very important, which now seems sort of obvious, but if people can rewind to last year, there was a lot of hesitancy on this front. We made the decision, which was we do not want the students to take a 2-year hiatus from these tools while they're here at school. Because, as you said, these tools are in the world, and our students are going to have to help manage and lead in this world. And so what we decided instead was we wanted them to be able, creative, competent, inventive, and ethical and responsible users of AI. So if you're a teacher, I think you kind of do have to start there, which is I don't want my students to be on hiatus from this while they're at my institution or even while they're in my course, because the world's changing in this way. So I think you do start there. I think the other thing for teachers, I would say, Julie, if they're hesitant, is you yourself have to become proficient in these tools. I mean, one of the lessons and meta lessons of a lot of my training is that before you get to should and shouldn't on AI, you have to be at could and couldn't. I've been in too many meetings at organizations and at academic institutions where people weigh in on what these should and shouldn't be for, what they're moral or immoral about, what they can and can't do. And oftentimes, and I don't mean to say this too overly critically, but just sort of invitingly, people say those things without actually having put their own fingers on keys very much. And I think that's uninformed. And so what I would say to teachers is if you want to begin to explore how to use this in your classroom with your students, like you yourself have to begin to use these tools much more experimentally. Like you have to put your fingers on keys. I tell people proficiency is the first step. Your own personal proficiency is the first step, and the pathway to proficiency is through use. I would tell teachers, get playing.
I'm so glad you said that. I actually was just taking notes, because this is a really important point, not just in the academic context. We've just launched a project at Tech NYC to help create capacity at nonprofits around AI tools. And the same lesson is totally true. I think there's a lot of fear. It seems, in some ways, it seems bigger than it is, than what a lot of the tools are to, I think, a lot of people. I mean, in some ways, probably it also seems smaller to a lot of people. But where the tools are right now is once you play with it, you kind of understand what pretty quickly what some of the use cases are.
Right, and especially advice I give people, and this comes out of some research from papers that colleagues of mine written. This is not my own work, but is use the tools in domains you're familiar with. Then you'll be much better at knowing kind of how to use them, what questions to ask them, and you'll be a much better assessor of when it's giving you good and poor information. And so if you're a teacher teaching physics, like try it in the context of physics. If you're a nonprofit leader, Julie, to your point, use it in the context of how you would lead and run your not-for-profit. So start in areas you're familiar with. And when it stumbles or glitches or misinforms, don't walk away. Push it and work with it and treat it. People ask me all the time because I do a lot of training, a lot of demos for teachers and otherwise, and they'll see that I'm saying please and thank you and all the rest. And they'll say, why are you being nice? And I say, I'm not being nice. In fact, there's times when I say, ugh, and this is frustrating and do better. And so they ask me why you like that. And now the sort of very familiar joke, it's not my own joke, is like, well, just in case, I want to be nice. But the real reason is not that. The real reason is I engage with it in a way like it's a person, as weird as that sounds, because it's like it's an RA of mine or an intern or a coworker or a colleague, because it's the surest way to remind me that it's not a Google search box, that you can actually work with it and give it feedback and try to make things better. And so I would say to people, play with it. And as you're playing with it, play with it in the use cases you're familiar with, the areas you're familiar with. And as you're doing that, if you don't like what you're getting, tell it and push it and ask it better questions. I mean, to come back to teaching, what do great teachers know? Great teachers know that they have to ask great questions. That when students say something that's not, quote unquote, bright, it's not oftentimes because the students aren't bright. It's because the question wasn't framed in just the right way. It can be reframed, it can be restated. I do tell people they can perseverate about, oh, I can't start because I don't know the perfect prompt. You don't have to know a perfect prompt. There are some prompting techniques you can pick up, but you can also just start by engaging with it. And I'd recommend they do that.
Do you see some of these tools taking the place of the RA, for instance?
I think these tools will take the place of lots of things, of lots of roles. I think that's true. I think that we are going to, people talk about a kind of agented future where, there's an AI kind of on your team. You're maybe working with an AI, you may be managing AI, maybe you're being managed by an AI. I think those are all eventualities. And we don't say that our computer is on our team, even though we use it all the time. So I don't know if the metaphor is quite correct, but oh, yes. I think that faculty instructors could think of their AI as being a very helpful RA or colleagues or honestly instructors. There's going to be contexts where there's some very interesting papers being written about in what context an AI instructor might be preferred to a human instructor. I'm not of the, I am absolutely not standing here at Harvard Business School going, this isn't going to affect my job or affect my work. It absolutely will. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to get better at our work and to think about how we can evolve in this future because it's going to impact every job.
That's a good segue into just quickly touching on some of the other risks, which you alluded to earlier in our conversation. In the academic context, there was a real flurry at the beginning. Well, at the beginning, but when ChatGPT first released their bot publicly, everyone was talking about cheating, and the New York City public schools were shutting it down. They were blocking it on school internets. They've since reversed course, which I'm really gratified to see. But there are other risks too, specifically in the academic context and beyond. What do you think are the biggest risks? Like, what are you looking for?
I mean, let's start with the biggest risk. So, right, I mean, we all know that there are leading computer scientists who will tell you there's a non-zero risk that these kinds of tools present an existential threat to humanity. Okay, so I think we have to acknowledge that very serious people on this think that there's some non-zero chance these things will be extremely detrimental to humanity. And so, on a day-to-day basis as an instructor, I mean, first of all, hopefully there are teachers who are engaging on this topic in their domains. But I think it should also give all of us the right amount of pause when you go into the classroom. And again, I have some very fun, exciting, provocative exercises, like my Storrowed exercise. But I always try to have in the back of the mind that even if we're, enjoying today, so to speak, and learning a lot, that we're also learning about the upsides and the downsides at the same time. So that's like the biggest risk. I think besides cheating, the more textural risk is that students stop thinking. The tools are so quick that they can lull you, and there's some papers about this too, again, not mine. They can lull you into kind of like just outsourcing your thinking and stop using your judgment. and just accepting these things. And I think that's dangerous. We need humans to remain thinkers. And so we've said here at Harvard Business School, like as much as we want to use these tools, what we do here is educate for judgment, and we need you to keep, exercising and using your judgment. I think the most important skill we're going to end up teaching people, young people and less young people, people of all ages these days, is how to discern the truth. And that has a lot to do with what's going on in the world, but it has a lot to do with AI as well. That you cannot just take what you're getting at face value. I mean, I ask, you and I have kids at the same age, and I ask my kids all the time when they say things, whether because they heard it from a friend or they saw it on YouTube or now they get it out of ChatGPT, how do you know that's true? It's the same question I ask my students in class and I ask executives. How do you know that's true? So I think the big risk is that we stop thinking, we stop using judgment, and we as teachers have to make sure students don't cease doing that.
I love that. I think it's so interesting to think about how we teach that, and asking that question, I think, is key. I think it's such a smart point, but I'm also so interested in how we as a society teach more teachers, more parents to ask that question constantly. How do you know that's true? Like, how are we teaching that going forward? It's really, really interesting to think about.
Just to get a little bit meta here for a second, you could of course build a little judgment bot that sits over your shoulder and watches you in your meetings and in your classes and in your coursework and just constantly harps at you like, why did you believe that? How did you know that? Double check that. So we can, without being too, much of a technophile here, maybe we can get the robots to help us judge the robots.
I love this. I'm even thinking about that point for a while, how we teach that, and the robots teaching the robots, teaching the robots. We're running up on time, but I do want to just quickly ask you a couple questions. First of all, I've got to put a plug for your chief of staff, your new, it's a blog. It's not a blog.
It's a newsletter on LinkedIn. Yeah. It's a newsletter on
Okay.
LinkedIn. Thank you. Yeah, chief of stuff. It's about AI, which is what I study, but I think there's going to be a lot there for people more broadly. Yeah, I mean, I call it chief of stuff because I was a chief of staff in my prior life in government, and it's a bit of a play on that idea that chiefs of staff do lots of things, but not all of them well, and that AIs will do lots of things, not all of them equally well. And so use them, embrace them, get to see how they're helpful, but don't completely believe them or trust them.
And let me just go just 1 second deeper here, because I think a lot of the listeners here, a lot of folks who read and listen to some of the content from City and State, our partner, and obviously Tech NYC do come from a world of government. And while we're here to talk about academia, you obviously, as you just said, spent a lot of time in government. You study this probably more than almost anyone in the world. So, what is there? Tell me like one use case, one thing in government you're super excited about, something you think is going to be really transformative because of AI specifically.
There are something like 200 to 300,000 people who quit or retire from governments in America every month, I think, according to the latest Bureau of Labor Statistics data. So people think all the time about, AI replacing jobs, and you asked earlier about the RA, but what about AI helping people who are still in their jobs and who have a pile of paper now on their desk that's twice as high because their neighbor just retired or quit? I think there's a huge potential here, huge, to support the people in government to do their job better, and to especially those that have been left in a way left to do more with less, because Deloitte many years ago called it the silver tsunami, this wave of retirements that continues to this day because the job is so hard. So these tools as aids to the humans in government is, I think, wildly potentially transformative. In addition, if you look at two curves, Julie, and you look at the cost of government, which we know is going like this, and you look at what my colleague Karim Lakhani talks about AI, he talks about it as the cost of cognition, so which will be coming down like this. I realize your listeners don't know which way my hands are going, but the cost of government's going up, and the cost of cognition, if you take Karim's phrase, of course, and we hope over time with better algorithms and hopefully with better entry costs, we should be real about those too, is going down. Then this has the potential to save us from a cataclysm, which is that government has made all these promises and all these commitments they can't deliver. So I think the aiding the people in government is just, there's a huge potential there. In terms of use cases, I mean, I could go through every office in City Hall, every department in state government, every cabinet in federal government, and tell you use cases for those places. And they're very serious ones, like where some cities are exploring how these AIs can help you triage 911 calls, to ones that are, a little bit more maybe idiosyncratic. But I know a mayor who is using them to read the sort of nasty grams he gets from his residents to sort of filter out the meanness, but still get the gist of what they're saying, because what they're saying still matters. Use is all up and down. Use is everywhere. And I really would encourage people in government to start experimenting to see what can help you in your domain. The other thing I'll say, this isn't quite your question, but I think is important, is there are obviously massive questions about how we regulate or don't regulate these tools. And my deep belief is that the more government officials use them, the more insight they'll have about regulating them. There's this tendency to think, I don't want to use them because I want to be a good police officer of them. And I actually think the other instinct would be better. You have to be careful not to fall head over heels for the tools or for the companies, but you can keep an arm's length distance, get to using the tools, and then get to thinking about appropriate regulation.
I think that last point is crucial. I've been thinking about that a ton. I think it is also true in the academic context, definitely in the government context, but to have a culture of trying, of experimenting, of being open-minded is really super important. And in some contexts, some academic and some government contexts, it can be really hard depending on who's in office. So thinking a lot about how we help get people more comfortable.
One small use case I'll share with you and your listeners that I think is helpful to people, especially in resource-constrained governments, is to bring expertise into the room that's not there. And so in my store road exercise, which dwells on these trucks getting stuck underneath these bridges, we can say, please name 5 top urban planners throughout history and tell me why they think store road is happening. And any government official anywhere who doesn't have 37 other colleagues who've been expert trained, or any mayor who doesn't have a head of a department of transportation, or any governor who's wishing they had more advice in economic development, they all can say, be this expert in this thing and just help start to give me some advice. And I wouldn't take that advice offhand, but it's a way to bring expertise into the room that may not always be there.
Well, that is super helpful, Mitch. I'm so grateful for your time. I'm so grateful to talk about this with you. I always learn something when I talk to you, and I appreciate that. And I think we'll probably be talking a lot more about this in the future.
I hope so. It's great to see you, Julie. I'm glad you're bringing this to your many, many listeners.
Thanks, Mitch.
So that was it. I hope you all enjoyed listening to that conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. Mitch is never not interesting.
I'm sorry I couldn't be there, but I really enjoyed listening to it, Julie. Thank you so much for that. And I want to thank our sponsors today again: Uber, Spectrum, Civic Hall, TikTok, Google, DoorDash, and Snapchat. Like and subscribe our podcast on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and iHeart, and tell us your feedback. We'd love to hear it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.